if you were to grow up in Colorado, if you've been around your family who experienced the West Slope, and then maybe your grandparents experienced poor mining practices on the Western Slope that left miners with lung cancer, and your parents maybe worked at Rocky Flats and you were a kid when it got raided. I can understand why you would have a negative opinion of nuclear technology and be skeptical about its use in your state's energy portfolio. Completely understand. So that's why I was a little surprised that it got passed and that nuclear energy is regarded as a clean energy source. And I think one of the things that probably helped with that is hindsight, right? It's a lot easier to look back on everything now and realize that these issues were not a direct result of inherent flaws with the use of nuclear power.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of PowerGab, your go-to show for all things energy and environmental policy in the state of Colorado. I'm Jake Fogleman, joined as always by my co-host Amy Cooke. And for this week's show, we want to bring a little bit of attention to a paper we actually just published right here in-house at the Independence Institute. Amy, you played a pretty big role in the publication of this paper, and as well as with an intern that you worked with. If you want to introduce this intern who's joining us today.
I'm actually really excited about this paper because we talk a lot about nuclear energy here on the show and the importance of it if Colorado is going to decarbonize and we are to have a reliable grid. We have to have nuclear. And I think part of Colorado's problem with nuclear has been its past and overcoming its history. And most people, or a lot of people, at least in the energy policy space, have heard of Fort St. Vrain and the nuclear power plant that was there and then ultimately converted to natural gas. But what they don't know is Colorado was a pioneer in uranium mining. I mean, we all have a past, and Colorado's its relationship with nuclear energy is complicated, but it's also been one of incredible invention, incredible innovation. And so really excited about this because we have Nathan Stout, who we're going to bring up on the show in just a minute. He was our intern last year. It took a while to get this paper published, but part of it is we were also waiting for the legislature to finish what they were doing. But what Nathan did was just take a critical look at the history of nuclear energy in Colorado and the relationship we've had with nuclear energy and why it's complicated. And there's no better person to have done this, Jake, because guess what? Nathan is a Navy veteran, and I hope I get this right, Nathan, but you're a veteran from nuclear propulsion, and I hope you can clarify that and tell us what that means. But you're also an electrical engineering student at Arizona State. You're in an undisclosed location in South Carolina because you have an internship there at the nuclear power plant there. So you know of what you speak. You've worked in the nuclear. You've been aboard a submarine that was that used nuclear power. So with that, I want to welcome Nathan. And Nathan, before we dive into the paper, tell us your experience with nuclear power.
Sure. Amy, thanks for having me. Jake, thanks for having me. Amy, it was a pleasure working with you.
It was a lot of fun.
Time together last year. And it's great to see you again. It's been a while. And I'm glad to get back into this paper. So one of the things that really excited me about this project that Amy and I worked on was the fact that I got to relate sort of my experience in a different perspective on the history of nuclear power as a whole and how it relates to the state of Colorado. Because personally, as someone who's not from the state of Colorado, I didn't realize that Colorado played such a pivotal role in the early history or the pioneering history of the nuclear industry and nuclear science as a whole. So I found that really interesting, that Colorado did so much in the way of uh, paving the way for pioneers like the Curies, even.
So, talk a little bit about that. And it started really with uranium mining. Colorado was a leader, well, was the first.
Correct. So Colorado's western slope is actually the first place in the United States that uranium was extracted and commercially used. So a lot of uranium mines sprung up on the western slope to sort of take advantage of this new industry. And at first, before the invention of fission, really, or the discovery of the harnessing of fission, people just used uranium for coloring, right? Carnotite ore, yellow ore, was just used for glass making and dyes and other processes. So things like uranium and vanadium, which was later used in production of steel alloys, and radium, which is incredibly valuable as an illumination source for uh, aerospace instruments and the like. Those were just left discarded around Western Slope mill tailing piles, and it wasn't until years later that Colorado realized that they could really take advantage of the abundance of natural resources, and that propelled them to really be a champion in that field.
I want to ask, it actually, Colorado was a leader in just sort of uranium mining. You brought up the mill tailings. This actually went on through into the 20th century, like through
That's
World
correct.
War
So
One, World War Two.
correct. So it wasn't until I believe it was 1914. I'd like to double check this actually before I start giving exact dates. Um,
Well,
but Chicago Pile One was the first controlled fission experiment in the United States, and after that was proven successful, that sort of became the spark for the Manhattan Project. Once the United States government realized that fission could be harnessed, it could be used for energy, it could be used for a weapon, then a fuel source was needed. And that's when Colorado took a look around and realized that they were the leading exporter of uranium and radium and vanadium, and propelled them to being the leading state in really the war effort as
That's
far as materials go.
Yeah, I love that fact because I'm a Colorado native. I've lived here for almost 3 decades, and I'm obviously a nuclear energy geek. We talk about it, like you said, on the show, and even I didn't know that. I didn't know the nexus that Colorado had to things like the Manhattan Project, and I didn't even know. I knew we had a lot of uranium out on the western slope, but didn't realize we were the first to actually mine it and produce it on such a scale. And you mentioned radium and its uses as well. How prolific exactly was Colorado's radium production? You have an interesting anecdote about just how much Colorado supplied radium in its heyday.
So I actually thought this was really interesting. One of the most interesting pieces of this research that went into the paper, that the only two places in the country that radium was really produced in the early 20th century was Colorado and Austria. And actually, Austria's radium production was already very well established and outpaced Colorado's by far, but were also designed to extract radium for uses in medical isotope research and its illumination properties for aerospace instruments, and so or aeronautical instruments. And once Germany occupied Austria and Austria's trade got closed off from the rest of Europe and the rest of the Allied nations, Colorado had a monopoly on radium. The United States had a monopoly on the world's radium supply for several years because of Colorado. So I thought that was incredibly interesting.
yeah, and so we were pioneers in this, and with uranium mining, also radium. But and people often say, but we polluted the western slope. And I like to point out, I think at that time, and this was one of the things that comes out in the paper, they were using best practices at the time, but those best practices are nothing like what we would be doing today. Correct?
Correct. One of the other things I found surprising and not in the fun way, like monopoly on radium production is, was that back in the day, they would use mill tailings for concrete filler, right? So people in the Western Slope, when they built houses, when they built towns, they would lay the foundations, and as a filler for concrete in place of sand, they would use mill tailings. Well, trace amounts of radium uh, was in those mill tailings, and so radium decays into radon, which is a gas, and it's also an alpha emitter. And alpha particles are a type of radiation that are incredibly damaging to the body if ingested or inhaled. So they're a really big hazard when they're inside your body, not so much outside. So the big reason that radon gas is a problem is because you can inhale it. Well, when people laid these foundations of homes using practices of the time, they didn't know that radium decayed into radon was an alpha emitting gas and incredibly harmful to your health. So years later, decades later, you have all of these towns that have high amounts of radon gas, much higher than really any other place in the country. And it's because the foundations of these homes are emitting radon gas. They come up through the floorboards and into people's homes. And it's not the fault of the people who laid those foundations. Obviously, like you said, they were just using the practices of the time. But as our knowledge base grows, as society, we start to understand that maybe we need to develop some different practices to compensate for what we know now.
Yeah.
And I think that's why you have older homes are always tested for radon gas. I mean, if you're buying an older home, you're going to get a test for radon, or they're going to require a test for radon. I mean, and we've seen, I mean, I've been through that experience.
Right. But it does speak to one of the early missteps, not even an intentional misstep, but just like you said, what they knew at the time, one of the early missteps of handling Colorado's relationship with nuclear materials. Just to fast forward a little bit to another, I would say, misstep, or at least in the public's mind, a misstep. Rocky Flats. Talk to us about Rocky Flats. What did your research uncover about Rocky Flats? Why is Rocky Flats just loom so large in the consciousness of Coloradans, at least those that have been here for a while? What went on there and what went wrong there?
So I think one of the big things that made the public concerned, well, two things that made the public really concerned about Rocky Flats and therefore distrusting of both government and nuclear technology was the fact that Rocky Flats was largely shrouded in secrecy for most of its life, right? It wasn't until semi-recently that a lot of the information about Rocky Flats was made unclassified or was declassified. And Rocky Flats was a nuclear weapon component manufacturing facility, and it was the only one of its type in the United States at the time. So they took in plutonium from other sites around the country that were involved in the Manhattan Project, and they machined it into weapons components. Obviously, that's a highly sensitive process, and at the time, before the internet age, it wasn't really easy to access information the same way it is now. So most people, if they even knew about Rocky Flats, didn't know the specifics of what they did there. And with a lack of knowledge sort of comes, people tend to fill in the gaps with the worst possible scenarios, right? So people start to think bad things if they don't know anything at all. When things are shrouded in secrecy, it breeds a little bit of distrust. And it turns out that maybe that distrust around Rocky Flats was warranted, because the FBI ended up raiding Rocky Flats to shut it down after they found, well, pretty severe mismanagement of nuclear material. You can go into Rocky Flats a lot more in depth than what my paper covers, but Rocky Flats was, in summary, a nuclear weapon component manufacturing facility that mishandled and misplaced some nuclear material. And that left a lot of people with a bad taste in their mouth for nuclear technology.
And you bring up a great point. It left a bad taste in people's, in Coloradans, certainly in their minds or in their mouths, but the perception of nuclear technology after Rocky Flats was negative to say the least. Also about not trusting government. So when you put those two things together, there was hostility towards any type of nuclear technology. And I will say, my mother-in-law worked at Rocky Flats for over 25 years and loved it. She loved the people she worked with. She had some great stories from there, but there are plenty of other people on the other side who have significant health concerns after having worked at Rocky Flats because of the mismanagement of this, as you said, hazardous materials. So there was a lot there to learn from Rocky Flats and what happened there. But the problem with that is that then it turned into a distrust of everything nuclear. And that brings us to Fort St. Vrain. So tell us about Fort St. Vrain. What the heck happened to this supposedly latest and greatest in nuclear technology? We all know, nuclear energy safe, reliable, and it's clean. So what happened to Fort St. Vrain?
Fort St. Vrain was an interesting case of what I would consider to be sort of an experimental reactor design. I mean, obviously, people much smarter than I, people with PhDs, large teams of scientists worked on the design and implementation of Fort St. Vrain. But it was the first of its kind. There was no other reactor design like Fort St. Vrain anywhere in the United States. And it actually used helium. It circulated helium inside of its reactor coolant pumps as part of its design. And helium has a really low atomic weight. It's really susceptible to leakage through seals, which have large differences in temperature and pressure. So it's part of the problem that Fort St. Vrain had was it had helium leakage through its seals. And from the beginning, after Fort St. Vrain was commissioned as a nuclear power plant, it was pretty much immediately confined to lower reactor power operations than what it was originally rated for. A pretty sizable difference too. We're talking more than 50% less power produced than what it was originally designed to produce, and that's just because of issues they had with the reactor coolant pumps that they could never really quite figure out. And once they did figure out how to fix these pumps, it became a cost issue. It was significantly more expensive to repair and replace and change the design of the system than it was to simply pull everything out and convert it to a test plant. So Fort St. Vrain wasn't a safety issue. It was a design issue. It was, unfortunately, the first of its kind and didn't really take off. It wasn't on paper, was an extremely efficient system, but in practice was very difficult to pull off in reality.
Yeah, and just to put it into perspective for folks, we talk about all the time how nuclear plants can last. They're usually licensed for 60 years. You're seeing them routinely licensed for 80, and there's no real reason they can't go longer than that as long as they do proper upkeep. But Fort St. Vrain was only in operation for about 10 years in Colorado, and throughout that time, like you said, it was constantly going down for maintenance and problems and issues. And so it's just another instance of, perhaps justifiably, it's an experimental new type of reactor, the only one of its kind in the United States. But just another instance of something nuclear related, leaving a bad taste in folks' mouths, at least folks that have been around for a while, which I guess brings us to today, where, I think you aptly put it in the subtitle of the paper, it's Overcoming Our Past to Secure Our Future. We're starting to see a little bit, the inklings are there of changing public opinion. And you wrap up your paper with the legislation that finally passed this year.
Yeah, I want to actually, just to put a little, one more point on that, because Nathan, this was interesting. You and I talked when that legislation was passed, and you said to me, you were surprised because you had spent so much time on the history and this complicated relationship Colorado had or has with nuclear technology and uranium and everything else. And I thought, you know what? I kind of was too. And there were people in testimony that were invoking the ghosts of Rocky Flats,
Yep.
of the Western Slope mining, of Fort St. Vrain, all that stuff you talked about
Yep.
in the paper. And so you said you were surprised. Tell us a little bit. I mean, tell the story of when you first heard it.
I was surprised, and simply because I had just written this very large paper with about 100 different sources I've cited about all of these different issues that Colorado had with nuclear, I won't say energy, and not really science or technology, but nuclear processes, right? All of these different instances of things not going the way they should go, but not catastrophically bad, influencing people's opinion in a negative way. And I imagine if you were to grow up in Colorado, if you had been around your family who experienced the West Slope, and then maybe your grandparents experienced poor mining practices on the Western Slope that left miners with lung cancer, and your parents maybe worked at Rocky Flats and you were a kid when it got raided. I can understand why you would have a negative opinion of nuclear technology and be skeptical about its use in your state's energy portfolio. Completely understand. So that's why I was a little surprised that it got passed and that nuclear energy is regarded as a clean energy source. And I think one of the things that probably helped with that is hindsight, right? It's a lot easier to look back on everything now and realize that these things, these issues, were not a direct result of inherent flaws with the use of nuclear power, right? They're all individual missteps in our history that contributed to public skepticism. And now that we're able to look back and see all of these things one by one, they're not as immediate and pressing on everybody's consciousness. But they certainly were on mine after I had just read about all of them. So I was initially very surprised that this legislation got passed.
Well, you weren't the only one because there were others as well, and those groups are still trying to keep nuclear from being deployed here. And that brings me to, I just want to ask one more thing, and I know we're out of time, but tell us a little bit, Nathan, about your experience. And one of the things we talked about over your time here working on this paper and working together, there is an entire workforce out there that of veterans, Navy veterans who know nuclear power. They've worked around it. They're not afraid of it. Their nuclear technology is, they're trained to do it. I mean, there's a trained workforce so that if a state like Colorado is going to deploy nuclear reactors to power their grid, there are folks ready to be part of that process.
Oh, certainly. When people hire, when managers hire for operators at commercial facilities, commercial nuclear power plants, they're not just hiring for operators, right? There are a lot of different positions within commercial nuclear power. Maintenance teams and the like, and even places like the Hanford plant in Washington, they have power generation on site, but they also do other processes like vitrification, where they turn waste into glass, right? And they certainly do pull bright, talented people from local colleges, from community colleges, and from state colleges. You have skilled tradesmen up to professional engineers and researchers. But then you also have people like me who come from the Naval Nuclear Propulsion Program and maybe don't have a degree, but have a wealth of experience operating power plants. And I would say there are a disproportionate number of operators, nuclear power operators, reactor operators in the civilian power space that come from a Navy background than not. more often than not, if you would walk into a control room somewhere in the country at a nuclear facility, you're going to run into a Navy nuke, and uh, those those people, from my background, highly trained individuals, and there are plenty of them getting out that go work at these facilities. So there shouldn't be any issue of labor shortage or trained labor.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because that is a fabulous point. I personally know several people that work with nuclear reactors on either submarines or aircraft carriers, and I know that they, getting out of the military, would be happy to work at a civilian nuclear facility, and that's just one more thing that our servicemen and women could help contribute to Colorado's clean energy future one day. But of course, we're up on time here. I will we'll be sure to drop this paper in the show notes. I think encourage everyone listening to take a look because it really is a fascinating read through Colorado's history. And I also have to nerd out of the wonky appendix you included with all sorts of nuclear terms. And it's just, for nerds like us, that stuff is fantastic. So we'll drop that in the show notes so folks can take a look for themselves. But Amy, do you have any takeaways for our listeners?
Real quick. All of those definitions, that was originally part of the paper, and this is me trying to read it as a layperson going, we got to put this in another part of the paper. It's a glossary, and it is a fantastic glossary, but this is one of my favorite papers ever. I'm a history geek. I love nuclear energy, nuclear technology, and so I love this paper. It's an easy read. It's a great read. And if you want to learn about Colorado's relationship with nuclear technology, read this paper. So number one, read the paper. Learn about nuclear, the relationship Colorado has with nuclear. Two, anyone can overcome their history. We can overcome our complicated relationship with nuclear technology in our history and hope that we will be doing that in the very near future. First step was passing House Bill 25-1040. And second, until we get nuclear energy, just make sure you have a generator on hand, because otherwise you won't have, without that generator, you won't have the most reliable power. But you have to firm your own grid.
Yeah, unless we can overcome our past,
That's
as Nathan
right.
points out. That does it for us, folks, on another episode of PowerGab. If you like what you saw here, you can head over to powergab.org to check out our entire back catalog. We produce new episodes every single week. We're also available wherever you get your audio shows, whether that's Spotify or Apple. And if you'd like to reach out to us to suggest future show topics or guests you'd like to see us interview, you can send those our way at info@powergab.org. We always love hearing from you guys. But until next week, we'll see you.